Um, Anyhow, so today we're getting into a little bit, continuing the Messianic Foundation study into the New Covenant discipleship letters as kind of a journey following after that. And we're going to, over the next several months, with a little break in September, just as a little plug reminder, all the holidays fall in September this year, and almost all of them fall on a Shabbat, which is kind of cool. Makes it easy for people who have to drive an hour and 20 minutes to get here for service. So it also makes for an extra joyful Shabbat time, except for Yom Kippur, which starts on Sunday evening. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through the New Covenant letters, but not in the order that you see in your Bibles. That's not generally chronological. We're going to follow as best we can chronological order going through the letters. They'll be a little different in order than what you're used to. And that's what I'm going to talk about today and why that's important for your biblical studies, for our biblical studies, and understanding the scriptures better. So, and if you've ever studied these things in chronological order, you may find that whoever led your study might have had slightly different ordering. It's okay. I'm not selling it. I'm only teaching through our kind of the way I feel like it should be landing. So there you go. So to that end, I've got a little bit of a disclaimer. If I can get my slides to work. There we go. Not everyone agrees on the dates I'm about to give you. Reasonable, godly, better read people land in different places on this, and if you're one of them, you're in good company. Possibly better company than mine. Here's my request. Hold your objection for 20 minutes. I promise it'll still be there when I'm done. Objections are like that. They're shelf stable. So there you go. When I was studying through these, and I was like, all right, wait, this person says this, and this person says this, and this, I was like head spinning, trying to wrap my order. And you'll see in the lobby when you leave, there's a handout that's going to cover the first era. So I'm breaking these up into eras of time based on when they fall. And part of the reason is I think that, or what's blown my mind as I've studied through this now, is realizing, wait a minute, some of these letters were written while the temple was still standing. And how important that is to the disciples. And some of these letters, as we'll see today, were happening in real time. And it wasn't like, 500 years later, we're going to write a New Testament of Jesus or something. No, these were like real time. And so myself, I've been reading through the entire scriptures in chronological order this year, and it's been giving me a depth of insight I didn't expect. Watching the story of God unfold in time has changed my perspective on the Word so much, especially looking at the Psalms when they lay down with David's life and all the struggles of Israel, and reading them out of order in the Psalms, but in the order of the story has changed how I view them. So I brought a proposal to the elders that we begin this kind of study, and thankfully they bit on that. And so here we are. So we're going to use not just the scriptures, we're going to try to come up with a plausible timeline and build from historical markers as well as archaeological evidence to try to make sure that, or at least try to draw some conclusions as to when some of these letters are written and why. And so for me, it's been extremely exciting. So we'll go this today. We're going to talk about era 1. Next week we'll start with the first book, which will be the book of Jacob, or James, if you didn't know that was not actually his name. So my hope is that this will help you fully appreciate the authorship and the context of each letter. But we do have to have an honest conversation before we get into this, and that is that this discussion will come up in everything you do if you talk about the Bible with anyone, because it is a point of contention for every cult and every person that's wondering if the Bible is true. They'll ask this one question: I don't know about you, but I asked it many times. How do we actually know when these were written? Anyone else have somebody try to use that? Just watch any debate with an atheist, watch any debate with a Muslim, watch any debate with a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon, this question's going to be in the mix of the debate. Those scriptures are corrupted. How do we know they were written that way, etc.? And so behind the question is usually a question of reliability of the text so that they can diminish it and say that theirs is better, etc., or that you're a doofus and you need to be, just living your life based on what culture says and what feels good, because it's all made up stuff anyway for power. But the question is, when I think about this, is do these things happen in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses? And some of whom were actually writing the letters. And that's what we need to look at. So today we're going to talk about 3 questions. What is the timing? Why does the timing matter? And how does this impact our study of the text when we go to read these things? So question 1, what is the timing? 2 kinds of evidence get us here. First is going to be evidence from the outside of the text and evidence from inside. We're going to talk about the outside first. External evidence, where the text touches Roman history. It's really important to understand that the Bible actually is functioning in the midst of Roman history in those days in the New Covenant. External evidence points to the New Covenant, touches just secular history. And so it's good for us to look at where the Bible and Roman records and inscriptions and historians of the period who had no interest in supporting the effort. It's not like they're writing to say, hey, let's help these Messianic Jews out. They really could care less. And so there's that. And so there's this one inscription, and we see it here in Acts chapter 18 and 12. It says, but while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jewish leaders made a united attack against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat. So the question is this a real place? And so there's this thing that they found called the Gallio. Oh, I thought I had it in here. I'll pull it up later. Somewhere in here is a slide with it. There it is. There we go. I just got off on my slides. All right. The Gallio inscription found in Delphi names Gallio as the proconsul, and it's a fixed point in time, 51 to 52. The Romans have recorded that that's when he was serving in that role. So we have a marked time that verse was referencing. Here's a copy of that stone that records this. And this is why it matters. In Acts 18 and 12, it records this same person. So we know that 18 and 12 marks that time, 51 to 52. Hold on to it. So that single stone that we see on the screen anchors Shaul's entire stay in Corinth to a specific window of months, 24 months that he was in there. And then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are written during that stay. So we know that 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are written during 51 to 52. Beautiful. We have one piece of time. Now we just have to figure out some of the others. In Acts 18 and 2, we see this Claudian expulsion of the Jews in 49. In Acts 18 and 2, it says, there he found a Jewish man named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jewish people to leave Rome. He kicked them all out. How ironic, the Romans kicking the Jews out. Happens all the time. But this gives us a second marker in time for us to grab hold of. 49, 51, 52, all these things are occurring. And then there's the geography of the provinces of Rome. And this is kind of like the third. And it's specific to the letter to the Galatians. The communities, the ecclesia, Shaul writes to in Galatia, could mean 2 different things on the map. There was a northern little area that was settled by the Gauls, not important, but just so you know. And that Roman province was called Galatia. It was a tiny little inconsistent thing. but by Shaul's day, it had expanded all the way into what's called Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. For those that have read the New Testament letters and see Paul's marching through Acts, all those cities are where he's going. And it's so cool, like, wow, all right, so these are literal places that have land. It's attached to this Roman thing. And so we know that there's these real places. But these are the exact cities that Shaul and Barnabas plant on their first journey in Acts 13 and 14. So now we have a time frame because those cities were not in action until 49 and 50. They weren't part of that province. And so Roman provincial records confirm that the southern boundary and the official use of Galatia as a province name started in 48-49. Cool, now we got another time marker. So Shaul consistently uses Roman terminology elsewhere, Asia, Macedonia, Achaia. He writes like a Roman citizen because he was, right? Paul was a Roman citizen and he was Jewish. So he had two citizenships, hence why he uses Paulos and he uses Shaul, two names. He didn't change his name when he became a believer, okay? That's just a misnomer by anti-Semites. If Shaul is writing to those southern congregation using the term the way Rome itself used it, then the Galatians letter was written shortly after the first journey. So we can mark it to mid to late 40s, trying to help you understand the early era. Pay attention. When did the temple fall? 70. So these are all happening before the temple's falling. Those of us whose gears are already kind of going like, oh, wow, okay, wait a minute. So what about, yeah, that's the whole point. And then there's another marker in time, and this is regarding Jacob himself. And this one's kind of interesting. The Jewish historian Josephus, who many of us have heard because his writings are one of the few writings that made it through the burning of Jerusalem. But he was a Jewish historian and had, other than being extremely flamboyant in his writing and a little exaggerative and sometimes to help the Romans like him, he had no vested interest in supporting Jewish lore or Messianic Jewish lore. But he recorded in 62 in Jerusalem under the high priest Ananus that Jacob, the brother of Yeshua, was stoned to death. So we have another marker in time that right here. So Jacob had to have written his letter before 62 because he was dead. And so we have internal evidence, and as well when we look at another aspect of this clue with regards to Galatians. And this is kind of cool. Now, some that are debating people, somebody will argue with me, I'm sure, send me a note on email. But Shaul writes Galatians arguing hard about whether Gentile believers must be circumcised and the keeping of the Torah in order to be saved. And that question was at least partially resolved in Acts 15 with the Council of Jerusalem. And I say partially because they kept fighting about these things until today. Okay. But the point was that there was a letter from the leadership, like let's say our elders get together and say, we are not going to serve bagels anymore, only donuts. It would be this thing that then when somebody was trying to serve bagels, they wouldn't come up with all kinds of other arguments. They would say the leader settled this already. We're going to eat donuts. Silly example. But so think about what this means. In Galatians chapter 1 and 2, Paul is stacking up every authority he can. Just go read those. When we get to them, you'll read them and you'll see. But he's building up every argument he can for people to listen to him. But Paul said, I'm right, and Maynard says I'm right, and Jacob says I'm right, and James says I'm right, and Sam and Charlotte says I'm right. He's building up all these arguments of who is supporting him. He says he had a meeting with Kepha and Jacob, and his confrontation with Kepha at Antioch. He uses this as building a case. And then the big one is that he didn't say the elders had settled this in Jerusalem. He didn't bring that up. And so, yes, some people would say this is an argument from silence because it's not talked about. But if you're in that day and you want people to listen to you, you're going to say, hey, those guys said I'm right. Especially in this young messianic movement where Jacob, the brother of Yeshua, and Peter and John are the pillars, as they're called in the text, of this leadership. They're leading the movement. You would have referenced them. Hey, they said do it. No, he's trying to build it up. And so there's an internal timeline as well. In Galatians 2, Shaul, Paul, describes going up to Jerusalem after 14 years with Barnabas. So taking Titus along, and they have this whole debacle that occurs up there. But if this is, and I think this is the famine relief in Acts chapter 11. Aid is being brought to Jerusalem, to the Jerusalem community before the council ever convenes. So there's a whole famine that occurs, and they're bringing stuff. They say, remember, there's lots of people who say, see, they're bringing tithes. You know, they use this as evidence to bring tithes. What they were doing is taking up collections for all the widows and the hungry in Jerusalem, because there was a famine. And that's Acts chapter 11. So aid brought to the Jerusalem community before the council ever convened. And so the letter's own internal chronology locks it in before the Acts 15 event. So Acts 15 is before all this. And then the other one that I always found interesting is, anybody else ever read James or Jacob and think, man, I am such a loser? Yeah, okay. I remember reading that at a retreat one time after being a new believer and just weeping on the floor as I read some of those things and thinking, especially whole other story, but it just was, it's just a very convicting but raw book. It's caused people to say maybe Jacob didn't write it or whatever, but it was just very raw. And I think that the reason is because it's being written before any of this Gentile discussions are coming up. It's, what do we do with them? And it's very Jewish in style and its concern. It contains no argument about whether or not we should circumcise. That's just a given. There's no Gentile inclusion controversy. There's no reference to the council. And remember, Jacob is the man who presides over the Jerusalem council in Acts 15. He's the leader. And so in chapter 2, he calls the gathering a synagogue, synagogos. I know many Bible translations change it to church, but it's synagogue. He leans heavily on the sayings of Yeshua without ever quoting a written text. And this is important because the Gospels were being circulated in written form a little later. And so he doesn't reference them directly. So we can assume that even that letter is early. It's really early. And so finally, we can cross-check all of these. I keep forgetting my slides. See if I can get caught up. I forget that I had all those. Okay. So finally, we can cross-check using the traveling companions, Silas, Timothy, Titus, people who Luke records in Acts, which lets us line up the letters against the narrative there too. We're kind of going to use Acts as like the big measuring tape in each of these sections so that we can kind of see how Acts lays out. And that's what in the lobby you'll see that little paper that I put that on. So I'll be honest with you about something. Not every scholar dates Jacob early. Some place it considerably later. But what I found is the ones who place it later also say he didn't write it. And they're a small minority. But I put it out there just so you're aware. I would say he wrote it. But it fits comfortably under like Josephus's writings of when he died. And it also fits with the timing of what all was happening. I mean, just think about it. Like these letters that just Jacob, Galatians, Thessalonians alone, they're like being written as the movement is happening in real time. Like, I think back to when we planted this community, and I'm sending emails to Sam and Charlotte and to David and to Michael Hertz and other leaders that I know and asking, hey, what do you do with this? And they're sending me stuff back. Those questions I don't ask anymore. Now, when I have questions, they're deeper theological questions. And that's what we see the letters doing too. As they progress, they get into deeper waters. These are elementary things. Watch your mouth. Stop treating people so badly, like you do your kids. It's like all these baby things to get them going, which is probably why Paul even says, why are you still drinking milk? You should be on to meat now. And now it's starting to make sense. It was a new movement, but it was still Jewish and everything it had going on. So question 2 is, why does the timing matter? Well, if Jacob, the letter was written by Yeshua's own brother, and it was written in the mid to late 40s, then that's roughly 15 years after the resurrection. Just think about that for a minute. Jacob himself was alive. He's leading the community in Jerusalem. Kepha, Peter, is still alive. John is still alive. The women who went to the tomb and were the witnesses are still alive. The men who ate breakfast on the shore are still alive. The men who he opened their eyes upon the breaking of the bread are still alive. The 500 Paul writes about who saw the risen Messiah at once, most of them are still living. And Paul even tells you to go talk to them. Don't believe me? Go talk to the 500. So all these people are all still alive. There's no gap of decades for some creepy, weird legend to grow. That he didn't actually die, that they snuck his body away and put somebody else up there. That's what the Muslims would teach. All these other crazy things that people would say. There's no anonymous community 3 generations down the line who quietly invented this strange, tradition and attaching a famous name to it in hopes they can get popular. They were all killed. And understand what this means practically. These letters went out into the world full of people who had been present. It would be like us sending out a letter into the world and you guys are all present and me saying that my wife gave this message. And you guys all be like, no, she didn't. I was there. That's crazy. Everyone would say that. If Jacob had written something false about his own brother, the Messiah, there were men and women in Jerusalem who could have stood up and said so. If Shaul had invented his account of confronting Kepha at Antioch, or Peter, Kepha was alive and reachable. They couldn't phone him or send him a Snapchat of, hey, this guy, look what he's saying about you, and and all these things, or a YouTube video. They would just go walk across the street and kick dust on him. These documents were released into an environment that could still be fact-checked. So hold on to that, when we move forward. But also think about this in light of Galatians. On the evidence we just walked through, Galatians belongs in this same little window of time, written before the Council of Jerusalem, while Jacob still presides in Jerusalem, and 1st and Thessalonians sit only a few years later, pinned to this, stuck to this Roman proconsul's term in office because of the Delphi stone. We know when it happened. We have one little anchor. That's what I loved when we had Ted Wright here for the archaeology talk. He's like, if we can find one marker in time, then from there we can move to the next marker in time, and we can move to the next marker in time, and then we have concrete things that we can say, no, we've got this. We've found the city of Ai. We can find the city of Ai, then we can find the next city, and we can find the next one just by following the biblical story. And that's why the timing matters. They're not set on separate timelines running in parallel. This is just one big timeline, one generation, one set of eyewitnesses standing close enough to see it and to catch a lie if it was wrong. And so this is why it matters. So question 3, as we wrap this up. Sorry, I keep forgetting I have slides. All right. 3 ways it impacts our study. First, it changes what kind of documents we think we're holding on to when we lift up our Bibles. Or your phone. Go back to paper. Go back to paper. Or rebel against the electronics. It isn't retrofitted stories to make, okay, hey, guys, we need a story that's going to fit up with this. No, this is written in real time. And it wasn't after the fact to settle some argument. They were already resolved. And so the first response letters, that's what these were. Urgent, fast, right now needs. Those of us that have college students, when they first move to college, and you're like, I know I put all this stuff on the list of the things for them to buy before they left. And you get the letter, where'd you put my toothpaste I told you to buy? Where, all the things that they didn't bring to camp, or whatever. You had it. Where did you put it? But they're written by people who were there into the crisis that were still alive before anyone knew. And I got to also put this in alignment with the fact that after this era is when the pressures really start to get heavy in Jerusalem on everyone and everyone. And so when we read them, we're reading people who did not yet know the ending of everything that they were involved with yet. Revelation hadn't been written. Like, they had the Hebrew scriptures, but a lot of them they didn't understand, much like we don't really understand some of them today. We pretend we do or think we do. Secondly, it changes how we read the arguments. If these are first generation documents, then we're not reading settled answers handed down from a finished system. They were building this as they go. This is why we talk about halakha, law for you. Well, we haven't faced that problem. Whew. Thanks a lot, Paul. Now we need another policy. Usually it's me, so I blame him. But this is the whole point. The movement was still working out who it is in relationship to the Torah, to Jerusalem, to the rest of the Jewish community who was fighting with each other, killing each other for that matter. That means when we hit a passage that feels kind of unresolved or raw or just doesn't fit right in your mind, our first instinct shouldn't be to we'll just kind of whitewash this and walk away. It's like, wait, what was happening? What was actually going on in that moment that they're writing this? And then how do I apply that into my life today? Third, it gives us a place to stand when questions come. Every one of us has had this conversation with someone who says, well, the Bible was written centuries afterwards by people with an agenda to keep power and all these kinds of things. Sure, there's always been people that will misuse the scriptures to get power. Absolutely. They'll also misuse all kinds of other things. But you need to be able to say, hey, there's an inscription that they found in Delphi where there was a Roman expulsion under Claudius that are marked in the Bible as time markers. And then there's Josephus, who had no vested interest, who talks about the death of Jesus, Yeshua's brother, Jacob, who wrote one of the letters at the time. And then there's this whole Roman boundary map that's all the cities are actually accurate to time. I don't think you're right. Most people have never actually been challenged on the facts. They just run their mouth from some YouTube video or TikTok thing they saw from somebody who has no clue. And so you need to have a clue. It's the same evidence a historian would use to date any ancient document. Does it fit with the culture and the timing? In the example Ted Wright gave when he gave that talk about archaeology, did they actually make clay pots with handles in those days? No, that wasn't for 500 more years. You can't date that way. And that's how we have to look at these things. That means we have to actually do some work. So here is the framing for era 1. There we go. 45 to 51 is the earliest layer of New Covenant literature before the council, before theological language could be developed. I mean, just think how many words that had to be invented so they could try to communicate with each other about what they were dealing with. It was I don't know. Call it the Holy Spirit. I don't know. I don't know what happened to us, but there was fire and we were saying all kinds of praises of God. It was a movement. A bad example, but you get the point. So we need to understand this is 45 to 51, and that's our earliest. And so we have 3 letters that fall in there. Jacob, probably written from 45 to 51, quite possibly the earliest, but as I said, there are people that will argue with me or you about that, and that's okay. Galatians, on the South Galatian theory, which is what it's called when you think that it's part of that boundary line of when those cities were given an origin, then it would be 45 to 51. And again, there are people that would disagree. There's people who disagree that the earth is round too. So, and then the third section of scriptures that we're going to look at before the end of this year, and we're going to take a month off. As I said, there's biblical holidays all through September, so we'll be focusing our attention on those, is that 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is anchored by the Gallio inscription, so it has to be in 50 to 51. And so for 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And so very young congregations with early questions about end times and answered with a very pastoral love. If you read that letter and then look at Corinthians or something later by Paul, you'll realize he was very patient in that letter compared to some of the others, where he says something like whatever the Greek equivalent to knucklehead is, you know. And so Shaul's answering all those questions with this like pastoral love and care. And so let me just show you really quickly how this lines up with Acts. Let's see if I got it in here. Yeah, I think I put it in. Let's see. Yeah, so Acts 1 through 7, there's no, Jerusalem is being formed as a messianic centerpiece. Jacob emerges as the leader. There's no letters yet. We don't see anything written in that period. Could there have been? Sure. Acts 8 through 11, persecution begins to occur, and the believers are scattered into that diaspora. And this is really important when you look at in Jacob 1:1. It says, Jacob, a slave of God, and the Lord Yeshua, the Messiah, to the 12 tribes in the diaspora, shalom. Now, there's some subtlety hiding in this passage that gets missed. People will jump on this and say, see, the 12 tribes are still missing. They haven't all returned. No. They've been scattered because of the persecution. And he's sending all of them a letter. They're all together still. There's a whole group of people that think that if you've come to faith, you're one of the lost tribes. It's a terrible teaching. But that's one of those things that the internet sends out there and people believe it. So, and so you just need to know he's sending this because there's this huge persecution. When we get there, we'll see that. And then when we get to Acts 13, Jacob, a slave of God, he says to the 12 tribes. So Acts 13 and 14 begins this first journey, congregations that are planted in South Galatia. Then the Judaizers arrive in Galatians, those that are trying to tell everyone, hey, you're not circumcised, and running around causing all kinds of problems within the community there in Galatia. And it's, like I said, really raw. And then Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council, and Jacob presides over that, and the Galatians is silence, puts it before this chapter. And so, and then when you look at chapter 15 through 18, I don't know if I added those in there. Yeah. The second journey, Corinth, 18 months, both Thessalonian letters are written here from there. And then Shaul before Gallio in 1812, which is a fixed point in Roman history. We have that marker. So as we move through the series, and every letter we study, we're going to look at where it sits there in Acts so that we have it all balanced out. And here's the habit I want us to build. Okay, so you got homework. You ready? This is your homework, and you're like, man, I missed the 1 week I knew I should have missed services. I'll send an email telling everybody this is your homework, okay? Read Jacob 1. Okay. If you say you can't find it in your Bible, look for James. Okay. All right. And then if you're really bold and you really want to get in, write the chapter out by hand. It changes things when you write Scripture out. It's shocking. You'll catch things you didn't catch before. And then when Maynard shares his message next week, you can nitpick him about the things he missed. Just kidding. So the question that we're going to raise every week is going to be, where are we in Acts, and how does this fit into my current life? So there we are. The Scriptures are real. Every part of the letters that we see are discipleship for your soul and for our lives. Even if it doesn't fit culturally, I assure you, if you sit down with the text and the Lord and say, hey, I'm reading this, and I feel like there's something for me, tell me what it is. He's faithful. You may not like what he says. You may have to write it down and say, I'll get back to this in a couple years. But he is faithful to us as we do study. And so for those that are online and here, there's your homework. Let's pray.